China-U.S. trade tensions rage on this week as U.S. President Donald Trump threatens another $200 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods. But how would such sweeping tariffs affect both American and Chinese markets and economies? And I talked with China's first performer on the Broadway stage. Why is he seeing a surge in his popularity, and what's his take on transcultural performances in a globalized era? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. But before we get to my discussions, I want to share my takeaway from U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech on America's economic revival. On June the 18th, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a speech at the Detroit Economic Club on America's economic revival. There are so many things I could argue about that speech, but I would focus on this one that I think really matters: the comparison between the America model and the China model. He is wrong, I believe, to compare these two because there is no China model. In his speech, he talks about the U.S. economy's record-setting upswing over the past 17 months and peddles the America model to the parts of the world that have not adopted it, asserting they will do so because capitalism and the dynamic nature of America is essential to economic success. When talking about Africa, he claimed, if America can put in place the building blocks such as the rule of law, property rights and so on, I am confident that the growth will occur with a model that looks more like the West than China. Well, bravo for the economic performance if the Trump administration can actually take credit for it. But Mr. Pompeo, there is no such thing as a China model. This term is what others have coined for China. The Chinese government has never officially endorsed it or used it. China does have its own way of development. The famous economist Joshua Cooper Rummel came up with the term Beijing consensus, which sums it up roughly: work extra hard, innovate, repeatedly experiment, protect national sovereignty and interests, and move in small steps. These have been China's experience, and 40 years of practice have proved it could be the right way for China, and it's an ongoing process. The key to China's way is not to copy others' models, but to find China-specific solutions. This is in steep contrast to the Washington consensus, which forces countries to liberalize their markets and economies at their own peril. Do according to your own circumstances and not copy others. When other countries come to China for advice, this is what China tells them. Just on Tuesday, during a meeting with the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un, Chinese President Xi Jinping stressed that China supports the DPRK finding a development path that suits itself. When China invests in other countries, it's based on mutual consent and mutual benefit. There are no ideological strings attached. Concerning the America model, I have some questions for Mr. Pompeo. What do you mean by the America model? Do you mean Libya or Iraq? When you say Africa should follow the America model, please share with us some concrete actions. Are you going to send American workers instead of soldiers to build roads, railways, hospitals and industrial parks? How much do you plan to invest in Africa next year? Mr. Pompeo, you talked about the rule of law. How do you plan to enhance the rule of law in Africa? By regime change or selling weapons to the oppositions? Property rights, another beautiful term. But when you're separating children forcibly from their parents on your southern border, there is not even human rights to speak of. What do you care about property rights? Therefore, Mr. Pompeo, please explain what the America model really is. What we have seen is far from being perfect. Meanwhile, please also understand there is no such thing as a so-called China model. Countries in Africa and other parts of the world will make up their own mind about how they want to develop. Or is that the problem for you? China has vowed to respond with quantitative and qualitative countermeasures against the White House proposal to identify an additional $200 billion worth of Chinese imports to impose higher tariffs on. U.S. President Trump's hawkish trade advisor Peter Navarro has claimed China has more to lose from a trade fight than the U.S. However, after his $200 billion threat on Monday, Trump will meet with GOP senators on Wednesday to revisit the future of ZTE, the Chinese communications equipment firm, virtually driven out of business by U.S. sanctions. In this risky gamble with China, is the U.S. as firm as it sounds? And what will the long-term impact be on both Chinese and U.S. markets and economies? Joining me for the discussion are Timothy Stratford, managing partner of Covington Burling LLP in Beijing, also former deputy U.S. trade representative, and Zhao Hai, research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. First of all, just to clear this out of the way, why is ZTE brought up again? What does President Trump want to achieve with this discussion with Republican lawmakers? Mr. Tim Stratford.
Well, so President Trump asked the Commerce Department to negotiate a settlement with ZTE so that ZTE would not be driven out of business and reach an agreement. But some people in the Senate thought that President Trump was disregarding U.S. law and the sanctions systems that had been put in place. And so the Senate just passed a bill that included language that said that ZTE should not get the benefit of this agreement. That is not yet law yet. President Trump is going to the Hill to try to persuade people that they should not vote for that and that they should allow the ZTE settlement to continue.
Okay, let's come to this $200 billion worth of Chinese goods to be put additional tariffs on. Why do you think the Trump administration is so aggressive and it's so determined to push this forward?
I think it's not just the Trump administration. I think that there's a consensus in the United States, both parties, think tanks, companies, that the Chinese economic model, and that's I mean the way that China develops.
Okay. After what I said in the opening monologue.
That's right. I think I think every country has its own model, and I think that the model that China is pursuing, even if they're not telling other countries that they need to follow it, nevertheless, it's proceeding on different assumptions than the United States and other countries assumed when China joined the WTO. The analogy I use is people are both coming to the same football field, but one team is playing American football where they have helmets and heavy pads, and they're going out there to drag people down on the ground, and the other side is going out there to play World Cup football, and they're expecting a different game.
Well, some people would say when you have equally strong players who understand the rules, who know the game very well, who have the same history and culture about playing the same game, then I think it is fair to expect. But if you have a team that is new on the stage, that doesn't really know how to play, that is maybe physically smaller and less skilled, isn't it kind of natural as well for them to protect themselves and learn along the way before they are totally beaten out by the other team?
So I think that's a fair point, and I think that when China joined the WTO, the economy was small, and the things that China did not have such a big impact on the world economic stage. But now China is a major economic power, major manufacturer of goods, and so if China is playing by different rules, I'm not saying that the rules are intrinsically bad. I'm saying, China has found that these rules work very well for them. But if those rules don't work well for the other countries, then you can also expect that the other countries will want to make some adjustments.
Zhao Hai, your reactions to this?
Well, first, also, there's a good game in China called Go, Weiqi, and if the two players are not on the same level, the higher level, the senior player will give one or two points to the other side to let them go first. So I think that's also another analogy in terms of development. And I agree with him that now China is bigger in size and also is stronger, much stronger than before. The trade between U.S. and China is so huge. It's basically bigger than any other two countries trading in the world. However, I think other than size, in terms of quality, China's economy is still much more behind the U.S. And in terms of technology, China is still far behind. So I think in that respect, China is still a developing country. Other than the cities in the coastal area that is equal to the U.S., even European, those cities. But I think the heartland of China is still under tremendous development and waiting for their chances to come. So I think there's still room for development.
But I think the American or the Trump administration don't really grapple with the idea of whether or not China is a developed country or developing country, right? They're judging from what they are getting or what they are losing out of trading with China. Is that how they're seeing it?
Well, I think part of the problem is that China is so huge that you could say part of China is a developing country, But another very large part of China is a very developed country. If you walk through Beijing or Shanghai, you don't walk around saying, boy, what a poor developing country this is. You know, they're cities that are lights to the world. And what the U.S. is concerned about is not China as a developing country, developing industries where it's behind. What the United States is concerned about is China applying the same techniques on the cutting-edge technologies of the future, where the U.S. and China may be on exactly the same level. And when you come to those new technologies, the United States doesn't think it's fair to use a developing country's methodologies for those new technologies.
What do you think President Trump really wants to get at the very end? Does he really want to even the trade numbers, or does he, you know, want to disengage with China and say, I don't want to play with you anymore, I want you to have structural changes, that the government must be away from the market? What does he want?
Well, President Trump has talked a lot about trade deficits, but I think at the end of the day that's not the real issue. And if you look at what's been happening in the discussion for the last number of months, there have been discussions about China buying more products from the U.S. But at the end of the day, that hasn't solved the problem.
No.
And that's because you have to look at the deeper underlying problems, and these are written about in the Section 301 report that the U.S. Trade Representative's Office published in March. And I think at the end of the day, if those challenges are not addressed, then we won't really be out of the woods.
What does China have to do that will be satisfactory for the United States? Sorry, I'm really,
Well, I think this is a big problem. I think that the things that the U.S. hopes that China will do are things that China doesn't believe are in its own interest to do. And so I think we have a stalemate. And I think that part of what we're seeing is a judgment on the part of some senior U.S. officials that China really doesn't want to change in the ways that the U.S. wants it to change.
What's China's position on this?
Well, as Tim said, China will not buck before the U.S. pressure, and definitely this kind of measure taken by the Trump administration, slashing $50 billion of goods on tariffs and then another 200, that kind of way cannot solve the problem. It's going to worsen the problem. I think at the end of the day, we need to go back to the negotiation table. Even if, the concerns from the American side is structural, we can still talk about it. Probably previous mechanism like SED is not a good platform to solve this, but I think fighting a trade war is definitely not a way to solve this. So I think both sides needs to come up with the innovative way to sit down and talk about this.
But Tim, are both sides ready to sit down anytime soon yet?
And that's the problem. I think that there really isn't a serious negotiation taking place on these deeper underlying issues. On the U.S. side, I think there is skepticism that China is ready to engage in that talk, and I think that's probably true. And so I think we're entering a dark tunnel where the U.S. will inflict harm on the Chinese economy, and Chinese will retaliate and inflict harm on the U.S. economy. And I think we'll find out after a while that that doesn't solve the problem. But we still have to figure out what does the light at the end of the tunnel look like.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Timothy Stratford, Managing Partner of Covington and Burling LLP in Beijing and former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, and Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when I come back, I'll show you the interview with the first Chinese performer on Broadway stage and find out more about his English version of an ancient Chinese memorial. Stay with me. The first Chinese performer on Broadway stage, Wang Luoyong, who was recognized for his debut in Miss Saigon in the 1990s, has stepped back into the spotlight some 20 years later by reciting a newly created English version of the ancient memorial titled Chu Shi Biao. Students in China grew up reading and reciting the piece, but the new English version has captured their attention. Many Chinese marveled at Wang Luoyong's passion behind the voice that channeled the power of Zhuge Liang, a well-known military strategist in China's legendary Three Kingdoms period. In the memorial, Zhuge Liang states his reasons behind the political campaign and also gives advice to the emperor on good governance. Why is Wang Luoyong's English version so popular, and how does Wang Luoyong look at these kinds of transcultural performances from the perspective of a Chinese artist? Earlier, I talked to Wang Luoyong in the studio, but let's first take a look at the video of him reciting reciting Chu Shi Biao.
Now the South has been subdued, and our forces are fully armed. I should lead our soldiers to conquer the northern heartland and attempt to remove the hateful traitors, restore the house of Han, and return it to the former capital. This is the way I mean to honor my dead to the late emperor and fulfill my duty to you. My only desire is to be permitted to drive out the traitors and restore the Han.
There you go. So, Luoyong, that was really, just a couple of seconds, and it brought us back to that period of time. But what was the story behind the production of this video?
That was after the first day we aired the show, and then
you mean the TV series
TV
where
series.
you played as the
as
the strategist?
Then they asked me if I could do a Chinese recitation of a Chu Shi Biao. And I said, why do the Chinese one, but since you're going to be doing in Chinese with such a stylized language, with a great musicality in it, the rhythm is beautiful. And then they gave me the translation. And it's very kind of, I hate to say direct translation, but I was rather than just not have the same Chinese poetic sense. It's a more direct conversational language.
So basically, this was a sidekick that you wanted to do as some kind of a side dish to give the audience.
Right. They're kind of a marketing strategy, maybe. Bring more people come to see it.
But were you surprised that within 36 hours,
Totally.
I heard,
Totally.
that at least 200 million people clicked on the video? What happened? What triggered it?
That was right after Christmas Day. Now, I thought it was the 27th or 28th they put it on the internet. And then the first day, they said, Luoyong, can you believe it? Second day, Luoyong, oh my goodness. And the third day, they said, can't believe it.
Oh my.
And I looked at the number. I was really, really surprised how many people, especially young people, they loved it.
But how come? Why so many people would want to watch an ancient piece of literature translated and recited in English?
At the beginning, I thought it was a fake number from a marketing office. And then after did some research or asking around, I found out this Chu Shi Biao was in high school Chinese textbook.
Right.
And then 90 or 100% of the high school kids in the 90s all recite this Chu Shi Biao. And then it has the Zhuge Liang's theory of about running the country, managing the government, or building up the farmers, and then the military strategy, everything. But most important of all is the people live through that difficult time before they get into college examinations, like equivalent SAT or ACT test. Everybody knows that. And also, now a lot of young people in China learning English.
But do you think, do you think if you would have done the Chu Shi Biao in Chinese, do you think you would have gotten as many clicks?
They won't.
But in English, they love it.
In English, they say, wow, this is so different and so cool. And I had people left their messages or little, sentences or phrases in my Chinese blog. Over 3 days, that was over 500,000 people.
Wow. What do they say? What is the
they
overwhelming?
They
just
loved it.
But do you think they understood? Of course, they understood Chinese text. But in English, you have to translate it in a way that is very simple, that flows well.
Sure.
Do you think they were able to appreciate the English literature? What was it that, of course, your recitation skill, your acting skill, your voice, your style is also very different.
There was several moments. Would you hand this?
This is the the
scripts
of the.
Because the beginning was says, "Permit me to observe." That's more for the word, it's great, 4 syllables, I mean, 4 words. And then in the Chinese, Chen Liang Yan, his name's there. So I put permit me Liang to observe. And that was a place I did a little adjustment. There was a 不妄自菲薄. And then put that phrase there with the next one. It is not the time to listen to bad advice or close your ears to the suggestions of loyal men. It's redundant because if we feel the meaning is so close, but that's so hard to translate the Chinese poet, ancient poem, into equivalent to Shakespeare or English translation.
What do you think of the comparison? Some people are saying this is like almost a poem coming out of Game of Thrones. Do you think that might also contribute to the success of the piece?
Well, I have to say the team, the creative teams, really did a great job visually and even music. It's just beautifully done for our costumes, and then just by art point of view, the show has the quality that youngsters really loved it, and then even older generations eagerly wait for the TV series going to be aired on the regular satellite TV network right now, maybe next week. But for the people on the internet, they have their own membership. I mean, paying their little fees, they can see it online, but they really loved it because the character is so famous. Not because they love the Sangguo, the 3 kingdoms history, because this man's living philosophy, working ethic, and his gentleman's agreement, his sense of responsibility, and keep his promise. It's today's people measure friendship or people worth trustworthy partnership. They all do that. They say, well, this person reliable or not.
Right.
They all have kind of a good example from Zhuge Liang. And he has many, many ways to take over the nation or the kingdom or the throne. He didn't do it.
Right.
He just really patiently kept his promise, helping the young, rather green emperor. And then even though he made stupid mistakes, but Zhuge Liang still patiently teach him and help him by appointing several of his advisors, let him to make the choice. And then people really like that kind of a person.
Right.
And trustworthy.
That kind of trustworthiness. Yeah. Can't help but asking the question, what does that say about the Chinese culture among the youth, especially today? You know, you teach them the Chu Shi Biao in its original form. Right. They don't like it, they hate it. But when you translate it into English, they love it. Right. You know, what is going on? And then we have these dubbing competition that is hosted by a satellite TV station, and it's, again, very, very popular among the young people. And you also went and participated in a dubbing a piece, and you also did in English, right? You also did quite well.
That's another thing about this English right now. The youngsters are so excited to learn English or other foreign languages because I think it's about a time they want to tell their stories. That they hear the Chinese stories, always domestic, family, closing door kind of events. Now they hear the story being, or little segments of a Zhuge Liang speech being, you know, expressed in English. That somehow opened a little door, like the director or producer. He did this with the Sima Yi, with the 3 Kingdoms, has so many characters. It's like, in a way, it's like a Game of Thrones. The prehistory about the European, the whole civilization. But there has a lot of a good point about friendship, betrayal, loyalty, responsibility. It's like people can using English to re-feel or re-check about this ancient piece that people will know inside out already in Chinese. And another thing is about right now in China, the love of English is just crazy. I insisted. I said, I been away for many years. I want to do in Chinese. No, do it in Chinese. We have tons of people doing Chinese.
Okay.
If you do Chinese, we'll kick you out of
You'll be
of
buried,
the show.
but
Right.
yeah.
Then, of course, even with the dubbing contest show, I was saying, give me some Chinese scenes. They said, no, Luoyong, do something in English.
Do you think they really appreciate the ability to have this tool to reach out and communicate with what's happening or get information, original information from the outside world?
I think right now it's a drastic change in China now. It's youngsters or young families are traveling overseas. It's become so easy, so often. And constantly they bumped into a situation cannot speak English. And then they probably simply couldn't find any store or anything they need. They couldn't tell clearly. Or even in the shopping or travel time, they bumped into a lot of embarrassing moment. That's why they're really pushing their youngsters, their kids, to learn English. Or the kids want to learn English on their own for the practical use, to be able to get through in the travel time. But another thing is in the movie theater right now, a lot of people thinking, if you're looking at Russian stories or French stories or even German stories, they dub into or they shot in English.
So you do have a very
It's about the time,
right.
right?
Do you think there will ever be the possibility that Shakespeare can be translated into easily understood Chinese and brought back to England?
Sure, because we just did, when I first time went to Western country in Belgium, Liège, for an international Shakespeare festival, I did first time Shakespeare in Chinese. 生存还是毁灭，这是个值得考虑的问题。是漠然忍受命运的暴力的毒箭，还是挺身反抗无涯的痛苦，通过斗争把它们扫除干净？ And then we got a great review, because when people hear something new, or yet something they knew.
Right.
And then they really feel the different sounds and different nuances brought into the materials they knew. Maybe it's the freshness is coming from the shifting little bit point of view.
That was Wang Luoyong, former Broadway lead, and that was it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.